was raised by wolves in Montana. And there's some truth to that. There's always some truth to any of my stories. There's some truth to that. And I'll just say the other thing he's one of the most creative people I know. And when I got a PhD and I knew I was going into conservation and environment, all the courses I took as a graduate student were in politics, law, and science, as though if you combine those, you could solve the problem. I've changed my mind. I think that the solution is a combination of science and art. And the best scientists I know have a little bit of artists in them, and the best filmmakers and storytellers that touch the environment really connect with the content of the science. And I know of no better example than Ian. And thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
For sharing your story.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you for that incredible introduction. It's an honor to be here. I was here 10 years ago, as the gentleman in the audience just reminded me. It's been an interesting 10 years since then, and I'm glad I've changed my presentation since then a little bit too. But to echo that, yeah, it's interesting because the art and science is an interesting convergence in my world, because I didn't study and I have no background in biology or science, but after you spend an inordinate amount of time with wildlife and you spend 12 hours a day watching an animal interact with its mate or its young, you start to see the most subtle details in behavior, and that ultimately is what can define a great photograph from an average photograph. So tonight, my journey is an interesting one. I'm going to cover a lot of territory in a very short period of time. But thank you again, Peter, I appreciate it, and to Aquarium of the Pacific and everybody on the board who are here tonight as well, and friends, Becky and Evan, who have also made the trek down from Ventura to be here this evening. So thank you very much. With that, that photo you see of me, that's me with a Laysan Albatross. And, it's funny because I end up looking up like this most of the time. This was a very pivotal point for me because I was asked to photograph Midway Atoll, which is midway across the Pacific between continental US and Asia, and it is most known for being the site of the Battle of Midway. And the 75th anniversary of Midway was coming up at the time, and I was given this unprecedented opportunity to say, well, go out, you can spend 14 days on this it's technically, I think, uninhabited, but it almost always has some people on the island at some time or another. But really, a lot of what happened on that island had less to do about the photography and film, and really with the power to transform me personally. First off, I never really considered myself much of a bird person prior to Midway. And the Laysan Albatross, which are probably about this tall or so, and I'm often working on the ground pretty low to the real low, as you saw in the last frame. See if I can remember how to go back. Yeah. So, I'm usually working quite low, and I'll spend, 10 hours a day there. And they don't really care much that you're there. Most of the population of this Laysan Albatross lives on Midway. And really, I knew that this was an island that was closed to visitation, had an incredible human history, it really was a complicated story to tell because of the human history and now its evolution into this flagship of oceanic conservation. It's part of this greater Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it really, the power of film and photography to be a form of visitation for people, I think, is one of the greatest roles that I see my work playing. This is a quick quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing or spend too much time on it. But really what I love about this Henry Beston quote is that it really talks about where my world is today. And a lot of it is about exploring the unseen parts of nature. And that's the journey that we'll go on. But actually, I am going to read it because this to me really embodies everything about why I do what I do. I was talking to Peter prior to this, and I don't see myself as a photographer or a filmmaker. I carry a camera around. I think the old adage of what's the difference between a professional photographer and an amateur photographer? So the amateur photographer has better gear. I think that's actually probably true. I actually just see the camera as a catalyst for me to explore and see the natural world and understand a lot more about life and what life is about. And the more you see, the more islands you go to, the more corners of the earth that you're able to see things, you realize that really we are maybe not fully understanding everything. And that to me is one of the greatest arguments for conservation. And so really, it's just a catalyst. The camera is a catalyst for me to get to understand life, and then with any luck, hopefully share it with people and share it with you here in the room today. But the idea that we patronize, I'm going to read this quote, we patronize the animals for incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves. And therein we err, and greatly err. For the animal shall not be measured by man in a world older and more complete than ours. They are more finished and more complete, gifted with extensions of the senses that we have lost or never attained, living by voices that we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth. So to me, that really encapsulates very much what my life has been about to this point. 2 decades of documenting, mostly. I've been all over the world working on assignment, but really most of my life has been spent documenting the unseen parts of North America, mostly the United States. And a lot of my work began with creating images like this, pretty images and landscape photographs. It began simple, calendar images, this Channel Islands National Park, trying to create images that were pleasing to the eye. It was as simple as that. Could I get in the Sierra Club calendar? Could I get a cover of a magazine, and making sure that everything was technically very correct. And I spent a large part of the first part of my career trying to get things correct. And what's funny is, I grew up as the son of a photographer, and so it's funny because one of my favorite nights of the week would be when the carousel of slides would come out, and we'd go through picture after picture, and I'd be like, let's go again, let's see it again, and see it. Now here I feel like I am doing it again tonight. It's funny how things go, but creating great images also is so much about spontaneity and recognizing an opportunity when it presented itself. I can't tell you how many people ask me if I put the goat there, or in Photoshop or something like that. And no, everything you see, and everything you see here tonight is not, there is no Photoshop in the sense of, no fake skies, no fake clouds, no fake goats on cliffs, things like that. But I really started to push the envelope with my photography. And most of my work in public lands and waters has focused initially on the national parks. And a lot of it was on unseen aspects of the national parks, or lesser known national parks. Lake Clark National Park in Alaska, I spent time there in the middle of winter. And I said, well, nobody goes up to Alaska in January to photograph unless they're looking for a specific species or something like that. And I ended up renting a small airplane. I actually had to kind of do a barter deal. It was a whole thing to be able to afford it at that time. And we took the doors off. It was 60 below. I'm wrapped up like the Michelin Man, hanging out the side of this little cub as we're flying around over the mountains. And this is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was always sunset more or less at that time of day. The battery drops down. The plane would swirl down to get a closer look at different glaciers. And we'd get out into these areas that no one had really photographed more or less at that point in time. And still to this day, I don't think much of the Lake Clark National Park backcountry. This is Mount Iliamna, an active volcano that a lot of these volcanoes blow. It's right in the beginning of the Aleutian chain, a place I'd go back, and we're going to see a little bit here tonight. But I wanted to show lesser known things. I wanted to show icons of the national parks as well. You can't have, I published a book on national parks, couldn't have a book on the national parks, couldn't be a national park photographer without having the icons. But there were so many other intimate moments that were also very personal to me that really I felt told the more complete story of the parks. And diving and being underwater was a large part of that. And so being in Channel Islands National Park on the backside of Anacapa, where these sea lions were, ended up being an incredible experience to show people, look at the amount of life that's living in our national parks, 30 miles off the coast of Los Angeles, and really just change their mind with how they see the world. And making our planet, in a way, look like another planet. When people look at some of these images, in Yellowstone National Park here, You know, you say, wow, it doesn't look like Earth, but it's Earth. It's all Earth. Everything here is part of this world that we are in. And in the process of photographing the parks, I also realized that, that's perfect timing with my voice, too. It's like I'm in the cave all of a sudden. And seeing things like Mojave National Preserve, which is managed by the National Park Service, is making people part of my work. Because I felt that we almost always can sense scale better. We almost sort of put ourselves in that position. We connect with it. We live vicariously through people. And so I always looked for the kind of opportunities that felt non-specific to an individual, something that felt like you could be that person in the image. You could be that woman standing on the edge of the Rio Grande in Big Bend National Park, or you could be in the back seat landing on the Tustamina Glacier in Denali National Park. Whatever it was, some human element, whether it actually be a person standing on a dock or not, with the tent. This is in Everglades National Park. Or even just keeping the person as a subtle, tiny little piece of the composition, like in Crater Lake National Park and in Death Valley. I've always loved dunes. I think dunes from an artistic... Oh, is there a mouse in the middle of the screen, it looks like? Oh, yeah. Is that me? No, I don't know. Maybe not. Sorry. That would give you the human perspective, huh? So you see the little person up top there. In scale, always trying to capture the scale and majesty of a place and really try to get people to emerge into it. This is one of my first selfies. I really wanted people, because I felt like, I could photograph this arch, but it didn't really work. And so I had a whole complicated timer set up and everything that is infinitely easier now than then. But none of these are that old. In fact, some of these are actually quite new. But the parks and public lands and waters have always been just an incredible part of my life. But getting into the lesser known parts of it, I think is what really blew my mind. Because when you started to take not only the human, still telling the human story, but then also, in a way, taking the human out of it entirely and looking at places that maybe have been uninhabited since the dawn of time and have been afforded protections that have left them as close to pristine as is possible in the modern age. This was my last national park that I needed to tick off on the list, which was the National Park of American Samoa. And we got to get in the water. Had all of an hour and a half to visit this one. We were, believe it or not, just passing by on a boat coming back from a very remote part of the world. And that is where I think from a filmmaker standpoint, as a photographer, I really started to evolve into this filmmaker who wanted to no longer just share things through still images, but really utilize the power of social media, the power of film and television. And I began a long relationship with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service after a long stint, and I've always worked independently. I haven't been part of Park Service or Fish and Wildlife. I've always been an independent person and company. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asked me to start documenting these three refuges. This one, these are refuges and marine national monuments. There's 5 marine national monuments in the Pacific. Only 3 have areas with land above water. The rest are submerged lands or completely submerged areas. The Marianas obviously being the deepest part of our oceans. The other marine national monument is off the coast of New England and is fumaroles and mostly visited by deep submersibles, as the others are. But for the few that you could visit, I was asked to document. And so Midway, where we began here earlier tonight, was the first of those. And I had this opportunity to go out, and nobody had actually photographed it from the air because drones weren't allowed. So we went through an extensive drone permit process on this to finally look at Midway after World War II, and you can see the runways from the aircraft during the Battle of Midway that are still visible, and now have a new generation of flyers that are essentially calling it home. These are short-tailed albatross. And mating pair, which is an extremely rare, a very rare species to see. Unfortunately, with the good and without people, inevitably we still see the impacts of plastics, and Midway has become very famous for the number of Laysan albatross that have met their fate at the hands of plastic. They see plastic floating on the surface of the water, they mistake it for fish eggs or squid, they consume it, and eventually their stomach becomes filled with it. And as some die of natural causes, many die of natural causes, many die from stomachs full of plastic. And so It's not an uncommon sight at all on the island to see this as they decay away with their bottle caps and things that they have scooped up off of the bottom of the ocean floor. But what's interesting is that the island has managed to also get through war, get through plastic in the Great Pacific Gyre and climate change and acidification, and it still has a tremendous amount of wildlife. And even though it is one of, I believe, 13 islands in this great marine national monument that spans 1,200 miles long and 200 miles wide, which, by the way, is also a very bipartisan thing. It was formed by the second Bush, expanded by President Obama, and is considered one of the largest conservation areas in the world, and it is the minimum required to keep these places healthy. So people say, well, it's so big, look how big this thing is, and we've got a bunch of them all over the Pacific. It's still the minimum required, and it's probably still not enough if you think about it. But spinner dolphins live in the lagoon there. After going to Midway, they were like, do you want to spend more time on tropical islands in the Pacific? And I said, sure, why not? So they sent me to Palmyra Atoll, where, again, I spent another couple weeks. It's part of the National Wildlife Refuge and Marine National Monument System. And this was another island system that was transformed by humans during wars and other activities, and is now slowly being restored by us as well as natural processes. But an exquisite place that is part of Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. And you can see as the bunkers from World War II were reclaimed, the beauty of the island never fails to inspire and seem to always take over. And there's lots of restoration and efforts taking place. It's considered one of the greatest marine ecosystems in the world to study, especially for shark populations, because it has been so well taken care of. It was not bombed by nuclear bombs as like Bikini Atoll and other places were. It's still obviously impacted by the global changes to our planet, but through a myriad of protections and conservation efforts, you see shots like this that are just absolutely mesmerizingly beautiful. And the opportunity to photograph and film them has been one of the great pleasures of my life. I will say filming these things is not easy. It's glamorous to sit up here and talk about the giant coconut crabs that roam, after a rain especially. They're football-sized bodies. They're land crabs. They more or less drown if they get out in the water too long. Photographing this stuff has been great, but we have a team of people, 400 pounds of gear, cases, state-of-the-art cameras and lenses, and then essentially, living in rainstorm after rainstorm, trying to keep these $100,000 camera systems, because this eventually became an IMAX movie and a bunch of other things that I'm going to share a little bit with you. In fact, actually, when you were sitting tonight, some of that was from these expeditions. There were 7 expeditions to the islands. But to be able to bring this, you basically have to befriend these creatures and spend a lot of time sitting, waiting, being calm, not making noise, not doing anything really, and just being very focused so that you can have the opportunity to capture these intimate moments with them. The third place of the marine monuments that we got to, this is the only area of land above water of this monument. Rosatol Marine National Monument and National Wildlife Refuge. The island itself, you can walk around in about 15 minutes. At low tide, you can walk across this stuff to this tiny little new thing that's forming over here. We think that another one might form over here. But the history of this is interesting because what you're seeing in this picture is essentially a lagoon. A lagoon that this is more or less a good way to think of it as the tip of a volcano, what it used to be. And as the volcano emerges, it forms an island, and then that island slowly, through rain, erosion, and time, sinks back in like an ice cube melting in well, these days a cup of coffee. I was going to say a glass of water. But an ice cube melting in a glass of water, and what remains essentially is the silhouette of that volcano. Now, essentially the edges of the volcano are gone, coral sort of finds its way and rebuilds those surfaces, and they come up into the air. So they're spectacular places, but to the seabirds and millions of seabirds and sea turtles that rely on them for nesting, this is pretty much it. This is 185 miles east of American Samoa. There's not a whole lot out there. And this is where they can land. And so you will literally find 50,000, 100,000, millions of birds, depending on which island you're on, nesting in these trees. And often it's the only time they actually ever, it is actually, like sooty terns, the only time that they ever return to land. So as they were to ever lose these low-lying areas, you would essentially start to lose a lot of these species. And in the inner jungle is very different from the outer edge. It's lush, it's hot, a little buggy, not terrible, to be honest, but it's also got a lot of little adorable moments like these. At low tide, I felt like I was kind of getting back to my roots in the national park, because as the water goes out of a natural channel, in this case it's natural, a lot of times they're man-made channels, but in this case it's a natural channel where the water flows in and out at high and low tide. You can actually go out and walk on what is called crustose coralline algae. And there are corals, warm water corals, that are growing on them as well. And then they form these little natural pools, and then these are corals that have been upturned by storms and all the other good things that happen in nature that can upturn rocks like this. But it is spectacular because it forms all of these really natural-looking things that very much reminded me of some of my earlier images of the national parks with the pools of water and Mammoth Hot Springs. And try and get you this panoramic here. I think it may be scooting off. And they're kind of fun to swim in. I would be lying if you're out there alone, you got a team on the other side of the island filming. I'm like, well, I could jump in for 5 minutes and cool off. Problem is the water is like 88 degrees. But it's, so you're like sweating while swimming, which is kind of not the best. But it is great. And the thing that's interesting is we're learning a lot about resilience, because these corals are surviving as water temperatures warm, especially during the day at low tides. As the tide comes in, the area fills up and it looks like this. And the whole lagoon becomes filled with life. Sharks and everything come in, manta rays, and it just becomes a spectacular place for fish and giant clams and a lot of other wonderful creatures. One of the other things I would say is, no one has ever gone diving in these places before, especially a lot of the sites that we were going on. And so we would see structures like this that no one had really ever seen before. So it was amazing to be part of something that was the first time we're seeing, by all these islands, by the way, from the air. No one had really seen them from the air. I mean, you go to Google Maps, someone stole my image and put it on Google Maps. It's now Rosatol, which is fine, because I want people to see it, and it's the only way to see it from the air. There wasn't even a good satellite image of it, and a lot of the atolls were like that. And so we'd have sometimes only 60 hours to go out there and try and bring back all of these different incredible places and stories, and would have to represent them in a way that, in some cases, one of the islands, they hadn't had anybody out there in 10 years. On Rose, there's probably only several hundred people have ever not been out there in history. They're uninhabitable, in some cases, islands. And so for me, it's such an incredible responsibility to say, well, these will now represent this place. These will be a way that people will visit them, and they will understand them, and that we will recognize the value of why they are protected as marine national monuments. So with that, one of the things that we did, I want to share a clip from our film. It's about 6 minutes long. We didn't use any visual effects, but we wanted to show, using the coral atolls themselves, how an atoll is formed and what life around it looks like. And so with that, I want to bring you a clip from our film on the atoll.
They arise out of the sea and eventually crumble back
from
to
the
the
middle of the
depths.
movie.
These beautiful islands are born ugly.
Beneath the Pacific, the superheated center of the planet reaches up and breaks out. Huge volcanoes build upwards. Fissures release poisonous gases at 800 degrees. The Pacific tectonic plate moves on. The volcano cools and begins to sink back under its own weight. The new islands become dormant until life finds them. Seeds are brought on wind and water. storm surges and rain starts to erode the exposed surface, softening the edges and flattening the peaks. The summit erodes completely away, leaving only a silhouette of where the crater used to be. The sleeping volcano supports a paradise on its shoulders. The old volcano becomes a safe lagoon. Green turtles follow invisible magnetic highways to find the tiny atolls where they were born. Coral polyps build their skeletons. Over the centuries, reefs form and then crumble into white sand. The coral sand itself becomes a home. Green turtles return to their nesting beaches. The mothers haul themselves from the surf and bury their eggs in the sand. They feed 1,000 miles away, yet return here every 2 years. A reef is like a great city. It's a complex community with cleaners, farmers, nurseries, guards, and gangs. But what fuels this abundant life? What keeps it going? The nutrients and where they came from was a mystery. We now know that the secret is in the shape of the volcano. Deep ocean currents hit the base of the underwater mountain, and the nutrients are swept up from the seabed. It is as if the volcano itself has provided a pathway for the magic of the ocean floor to emerge into the sunlight. The city has its celebrities. Black-tip reef sharks look out for unwary fish. One sign of a healthy ecosystem is the abundance of large predators like sharks. Shark scientists use Palmyra as a baseline, as an ideal shark community. Almost everywhere else, their numbers have declined dramatically. There are not a lot of dangerous encounters here, but you should keep your eyes open. Perhaps the most impressive of these underwater travelers are the rays. On an 18-foot wing, manta rays glide hundreds of miles, navigating with the currents and contours of the volcanic chain. Some mantas spend all of their time here at Palmyra. It's one of the last strongholds for this threatened species. In the late afternoon,
just a little preview from it. Continues on. So that's from Indo-Pacific. It's mostly for younger audiences. K through 12 is we're designed for and has been a way to share it on the giant screen. So I apologize for a little bit of lag. I think it's just having trouble buffering through the system. But so you can see the spectacular aspect of the marine world that exists out in those places. The thing that followed up with it was after going out to the islands, I had the opportunity to go to a whole bunch of other places, and they said, well, we really love to start to look at the rest of the unknown parts of our protected National Wildlife Refuge System. And so we traveled to Alaska and even into San Diego, where the tern population, I don't know if anybody's heard about the drone that crashed out there. Yeah, lots of space. So this is not that place. And it was not our drone. We have never flown a drone in a place like that, but this is another elegant tern colony in San Diego Bay that's right there, part of the urban environment, and people don't realize is there. And so we spent a lot of time, I've spent a lot of time focusing on urban environments and looking at how people connect with nature, and then looking at how to brand the National Wildlife Refuge System. Because what happens in doing the national parks, they've got this great marketing campaign of knowing, we've got Delicate Arch and Old Faithful and all of that, but the National Wildlife Refuge System is the largest network of protected lands and waters in the world. Including the oceanic areas in that network, you're looking at almost 850 million acres compared to, I think it's about 85 million acres in the park. If you're only looking at a park system combined. If you're looking at just land for land, surface area, about 115 million acres in the National Wildlife Refuge System, yet people don't really know it's there. And so how do you protect a place that you understand exactly what it's there? And people know it's there, and they get 30, 40 million visitors a year, maybe 50 million visitors a year nowadays. But I wanted to look at the icons and start to get people to say, well, look, this looks like it could be Yellowstone National Park, but it's actually in Colorado at Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which is right inside Denver city limits. And that it's an experience that people can have right there in their backyards. And there were many stories like that within the refuge system. And there were also just so many fantastic visuals within the refuge system, such as on Kodiak Island. Lots of airplanes. By the way, most of my images, very rarely are there drones except in places that we could use nothing but. But excuse me, the areas that we would cover, you couldn't reach with a drone. And if we used a drone, a lot of the time, we would actually take a helicopter and fly that into an area, or a fixed wing plane, fly that in or land on a glacier, and then take the drone out and then fly that over it. Just because the technology for stabilization allowed us to do so much more. But the diversity of the refuge system was incredible, but it also is arguably, and I say arguably, one of the most contested or well-known contested things in history, because I remember one of the first times I ever heard of the Arctic was Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and learning about the challenge that was happening with the oil there and the oil lease on the land in Arctic. And it's interesting because I was a kid, essentially, when I first heard about a place, and it was for fossil fuels, and I didn't really know what was there. And finally, after all these years, I remember having an imagination. I remember seeing an old newspaper with a black and white photo that showed me the Arctic. And so now here I am, almost 40 years later, and I'm able to go and see it myself. And I was able to see polar bears and a lot of other things in those places. And so that was a transformation for me that was interesting, because it took something that you just read about and it made it very real. And so I tried to constantly think, as I went through all these different refuges, how do I take something and make it real for people? And I think the three-dimensional aspect of storytelling that comes with film really allows you to do that. But Arctic just truly blew me away. One of the arguments that a lot of people make is that the area that's going to be drilled is not the area that's always used in the photos, and there's not really anything there. That's another big one. There's no mountains and rivers and all this other stuff. But everything is connected, and we don't really understand how deep those connections are. I mean, we really are just beginning to understand migrations, really, in many ways, and how great they are and how interspecies things are connected. And an interesting thing I'm about to tell you about, like the Laysan Albatross, for instance, everything is deeply connected in vast, vast ways that we're just starting to reveal. And so when we think about the Arctic and we look, really wonder about a place like this and say, well, geez, what more do we not understand that this place has yet to reveal to us? But this was one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. This is in the interior. We went to all the areas that would be drilled as well. There is a lot to lose, in case anyone was wondering. It was filled with life. Caribou running everywhere. This is one I startled. I saw him go up this way. I go up the other way. I'm like, all right, well, maybe I can get over this as they come up. But we were walking right towards each other on a mountain. And I was downwind, I guess. I wasn't really paying too much of attention. I'm just walking up, and we both kind of come up. And his head's down, or her head's down, and all of a sudden kind of looks up, snorts, and all four legs come up into the air. That's my Rudolph shot. And I catch her. I managed to catch one frame, and then I also snorted, probably had both feet up in the air, and then we went our separate ways. But just a beautiful place. But this is the area exactly where the drilling will take place, down to the inch. So if you want to talk about what's not there, this is a great example of it. It's an area that definitely has a lot of culture and traditions. This has become one of the best places in the country. It's called Kaktovik, Alaska. It's one of the best best parts of our country. Well, actually, yeah, one of the best parts of the country to see polar bears in the United States, and it's becoming a very busy area because they're waiting longer and longer for sea ice to form, and so you're seeing a lot of them. So this is some of the sea ice out there in the background. Didn't have a whole lot of time here. They weren't terribly pleased. I don't think that I was there photographing in that area. There were a lot of other photographers there, but it was a very difficult process, to say the least, and after a couple days, really had to leave. But it was a really fantastic spot, and I definitely think if you ever have the opportunity to get up to the Arctic, you do so. But there's a lot, obviously, there, a lot there to lose. I'm going to skip a little bit through. This is all part of Arctic and Kenai as well. This is after the fire, a couple of years. That's actually fireweed, that purple that you see in there. Really just pretty. Beautiful area, and all a part of the interior areas. A lot of these are interior areas that are protected under the Wilderness Act. So you have the refuges, you have the marine monuments, and then within some of these areas you have the Wilderness Act, which means no motorized vehicles. You can't fly over them on a tour in a helicopter. You can't land in them. You can only get there on foot. And so they're truly put aside for the purpose of staying wild. As part of our work, we've also looked at communities and refuges within different communities. This is a new refuge in Albuquerque. Not newish, I guess, Valle de Oro, right inside Albuquerque. And there's just a huge economic benefit to all of these refuges as well. He's smiling at me. It's an Arctic fox. In its non-white colors. It's not quite in the winter colors yet, so they're really beautiful creatures. This is also in the wilderness area of Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. A lot of people know Kenai National Fjords National Park. You go up to the mountain and you go back down the mountain, and then you'll be here. Only way to get here is to walk about 120 miles on foot. And you'll get to see the Tustamina Glacier. What's hard to imagine is something about the scale is so hard, and unfortunately I couldn't do a selfie on this one unless I walked down there, but I'm probably smaller than this right here, a tiny little speck. This is about the size of a house. This is probably about the size of the aquarium that we're in right here. So, it's just the sense of scale. Like, I thought I could fly a drone across this. The drone ran out of batteries before it hit this ledge. It had to turn around. It was a 20-minute flight at 30 miles an hour. So the sense of scale is such a hard thing to get when you look at glaciers, but yet then think about how fast they start to go, and you realize what we're really up against as something at that scale and what that really means for our oceans. One of the last stories I really want to share with you this evening is one of the most recent ones. I actually have two stories, one brief one at the end. But this was an interesting sort of twist. So after all that time in the Pacific, almost 2 years in the Pacific, great, because I could work barefoot in a pair of shorts every day, and it was fantastic. Even though carrying around all the gear, it was pretty good. We had the opportunity to join the only research vessel in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the RV Tekla, and went out across the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutian Islands, yet kind of going in this theme of unseen worlds and places, are so often overlooked in Alaska's story. Alaska is a great destination. People go to the beginning of the Aleutian Islands. We went to the end of them. And if you're not familiar with the Aleutians, they're that, if this is Alaska, it's that little tail that comes off the end all the way out. I spent, there's 2,500 islands approximately that are on a map. Some are on the map, some are not on the map because they're constantly being formed. There's almost 70 some volcanoes or so in the Aleutians. It's one of the most volcanically active parts of the world. It's the northern edge of the Ring of Fire. And almost all of those islands, especially once you get a little bit further from the mainland, are almost entirely uninhabited. A vast majority in the interiors are relatively, if not completely, unexplored. Certainly not in modern times. And in fact, they are almost impenetrable to us. There's no docks on beaches. There's no trails. There's certainly no services. There's plenty of fresh water if you like rain. And they're frequently raining in very temperate, very mild temperatures. But it's hard to understand this grass is about as high, almost the middle of my chest. It's quite deep. It doesn't look it. It's a lot like a tundra would be in a way. Very thick, very difficult to move through. It's also very, because it is wet, you're constantly slipping on it and potentially sliding on it, which, I did on a smaller hill, but nothing too crazy. But this was a waterfall that we wanted to see, that there is no way to get to it other than to walk up to it. And in this case, we used a drone to actually get this particular shot, but also did a hike up to it. And it was an incredible privilege, an opportunity to once again say, well, this is part of our public lands and waters. This is the unseen part of what is protected. Protected as a refuge, protected with wildlife first in mind. And to know what's there is I think, incredibly important. We want to know what is there. They do occasionally stick people out on the island for field camps from 3 months to 6 months. This is the original quarantine. A lot of people were begging to go back at one point, but essentially they live very simple with everything they need for 3 months. They get a resupply at 3 months to stay another 3 months, but the resupply may not come, so they have to have everything they need. It's usually no more than 2 people in a camp that size is normal, and they're there to assess the populations of the wildlife and see how healthy they are, because in order to really understand if wildlife populations are healthy, you have to look at long-term trends and data. The last stop on this expedition was incredible. This is Boguslof Island, another very volcanically active place, much like the atolls further to the south. In the Pacific where I was, this is mostly a submerged volcano. And it's a massive volcano, and this is just the tip we're seeing. And so this is the caldera right here, the active part, and there's our little expedition vessel. And it's hard to see exactly on this screen, but this whole area is covered in one of the largest northern fur seal colonies in the world. They come here because there's nutrient-rich waters, mostly generated by the upturning of nutrients in the water and plankton and whales and all the other things that exist on each other within this environment, but this has become one of their big safe havens. When we left, a week later, we found out that this little lagoon right here was gone due to seismic and geologic activity, small eruptions and shifts and things like that, earthquakes that are constantly happening. So we worked closely with the Alaska Volcano Observatory to get out there. We were able to get on the island and actually see what it was about. And again, first time really ever documenting this in this level of detail. Incredibly challenging. Arctic waters. We're in the Bering Sea in the North Pacific. If you've seen Deadliest Catch, that's what we're up against. Beach landings, we're always in Arctic float jackets. The water's cold. We basically lived in these waders. If the boat came up and it flipped, it could dump everybody out. We covered 3,000 miles on this expedition with our gear, And in the course of 3,000 miles, we never saw one other boat. So you give you an idea of how remote the place is. If you have an emergency, it's not the easiest thing in the world. Everybody went through, especially for the coral atolls, went through rigorous health tests going out there, down to x-rays of the jaw. But we had lung capacity tests, swim tests, wilderness survival, plane survival in the case of small aircraft crashes, blood tests, sanity tests, which they should really do that one at the end of the trip. Anyway, but it was, it's the trip of a lifetime. But one of the big surprises is still this human footprint that seems to always evade. And what most people didn't realize, and what was interesting, was the connection to these coral atolls to the Aleutian Islands, in that they had a World War II history, and it's not as known as the Battle of the Pacific that everybody thinks of, in the theater, the World War II theater of Battle of the Pacific. And we think of Midway, we think of all of those kinds of things, but you go out here where nobody goes, that they're essentially preserved by remote isolation, and you still see shipwrecks, artillery guns sitting on the shore, pointing towards the harbor. Two of the islands were occupied by Japanese forces. While exploring in the islands, we found gas masks laying there as though they were there yesterday. And probably the real pinnacle of this was a B-24 bomber that was in situ where it crashed over 75 years ago during World War II. It's one of only two in the world that still is where it ended its journey. And they basically had this narrow area that they could crash, and they both survived. Or I don't know if it was two pilots or how many there were on board. I forget now, but everybody survived, and they were later rescued. But it was a sign of how our mark really doesn't dissipate very quickly with time. Wildlife, animals, they recover very slowly. Our mark on the landscape recovers slowly. And even though most of these islands were uninhabited and never seen people, some of them did have quite a bit of action, but they are stunningly beautiful places. And I should move this slide, but this is actually that first seal colony I was talking about. That's that lagoon. I must have moved this. So you can see these are actually stellar sea lions over here, and this is 140,000 northern fur seals. And they're called fur seals. They used to be used for their fur. And now are protected and have rebounded and now are starting to deplete again. The islands are incredibly important for seabird colonies as well, and these are auklets, crested auklets, which I just love. They're goofy looking things, and we sat in one of the largest colonies of these ever. So it was a super magical time. I have one little clip. It's a little behind the scenes thing of me going out. It's not a glamorous job, so it's just a few minutes long. Hopefully it plays a little bit better than the last one. But it just shows you kind of the awkwardness, but also the upside of working in these places. And all of this was created into a new show, which you may have seen. It's been out now for a few months, called The Last Unknown. It's on Discovery Plus streaming. And this is a little bit of behind the scenes of that.
Most people think my life as a nature photographer is full of moments like these.
It's a really great wildlife moment.
But it's filled with a lot of tough challenges.
Nope, total miss. My entire professional career has prepared me for this moment because I keep getting done all day long. It's amazing.
Everything leading up to the moment I take a photo is without a doubt the hardest part of the job. And this journey to a remote part of Alaska is no exception.
Whew, that's brutal.
Join me, Ian Shive, as I share all the behind-the-scenes moments that took place while on a 6-week journey to one of the most remote and uninhabited places on Earth.
This is part of our digital series as well.
There's nothing more exciting than photographing a place that is completely unknown, where the beaches have no docks, and the hillsides have no trails, where the only sounds you hear are the endless squawks of millions of seabirds, performing an ancient ritual as old as history itself.
That's incredible.
We're headed to a protected area known as Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, a volcanically active archipelago that stretches from mainland Alaska towards Russia. It's comprised of 2,500 islands that show up on a map and a bunch of jagged rocks and islands that don't.
We can always get you on the beach.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if we can always get you back.
On a 6-week expedition deep into the Aleutian Islands. I'm here to document the work of the scientists who are measuring the health of the wildlife populations and ocean.
What are we looking at, Steve?
Stellar sea lions. Not only looking at them, but we're listening to them because you can hear them roaring.
As a photographer, there's no shortage of epic opportunities.
Wow. There's ribbons of birds flying off this hillside here. It's unbelievable. This is the closest we've been able to get to actual volcanic activity.
And there were some moments that were better left in the field.
Oh shoot. My lavalier just went down my pant leg. Are you filming this?
Oh, I'm filming it.
Thanks, guys. I think I'm getting seasick. Lens on top. 57-mile-an-hour winds, 40 degrees, a light mist. Yep, this is the Aleutian Islands.
The weather is almost always just above freezing and super wet.
This is the adventure of coming to a place like this. You basically have to say, I'm going to go into any element, into any condition, and I'm going to get the shot.
Or trying to stay warm in 70-mile-per-hour winds. But once you get used to the realities of the environment, there's lots of once-in-a-lifetime moments to be had, too.
Absolutely exhilarating view. Welcome to beautiful downtown Amchitka. I'm Ian Shive, and I'll be your tour guide here today. There we go. Here we go. Can't get better than hundreds of whales breaching at sunset. You immediately feel very inspired here. Profoundly special experience.
It's easy to glamorize the job of a nature photographer and filmmaker, but it comes with a lot of risk.
That's a good push.
Coming all the way out here to this last unknown place is worth it, because the photo I've captured is more than just a photo, but a milestone for all the moments leading up to it. And it's the opportunity of a lifetime to share one of Earth's great wild places.
All right, a little look behind the lens there. So that's the last unknown. Encourage you to check it out. So one last thought before we go to a Q&A. One of the things I wanted to mention about being out on in the islands. So here we are. We're out in the coral atolls, and we see this Laysan Albatross, right? Like we started today. I'm down on the ground filming and photographing them. And then I'm on a boat up in the Aleutian Islands, 3,000 miles north, and I see something go across the bow. And I go, God, that looks just like the Laysan Albatross that I saw on Midway Atoll. And what I didn't realize at the time is it was the Laysan Albatross that we saw on Midway Atoll. It had traveled all this way up to feed, essentially. Actually, I forget, I might have the mileage wrong. I forget how many miles it was. Thousands of miles, though. And it was here in basically a whole other climate that it had gone to feed, and they had, I started talking to scientists, said, yeah, we tracked it. We tracked a lot of the Laysan. They come up here, they do this curve looking for areas to feed. They get up to the Aleutian Islands. And then somehow, they just know right where to go, straight line back, one shot, without stopping, to Midway Atoll. So they go up to Alaska for lunch and come back. And the mind starts to think about that and think about the connected aspects of it and the interconnectedness of all of it and how much we don't really understand about it, which takes me to this high-tech project we're working on now. We're working with a great team. My colleague and friend Becky is part of this, who's here tonight as well. We're really just starting to scratch the surface of it, but we're starting to look at, this is a bunch of western screech owls, I believe, that we were working with the museum, Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, to take a look at what animals might see. Because we know what we see, but we all see an RGB, essentially. And what has been speculated and what people are starting to learn, and as new technologies emerge, is we're actually being given an opportunity to see the world through an animal's eyes, looking at, we'll get into fine details, but looking at the structure of their eyes and everything else that comes with it. Essentially, looking at bands of light that they can see that we cannot. So in the spectrum of light, we see in the middle, more or less, and there's a bunch of light on this end, and there's a bunch of light on this end. Fish see a bunch of it on this end, and birds see a bunch of it on this end, and we don't see any of it at all. And that means that they see a world we don't see. So all around us in this room right now, there's an entire unseen world. In this aquarium, inside the tanks and inside the different exhibits, those fish are seeing something we can't see, we are unable to see. Much like that quote I started in the beginning about the unseen world of nature and the senses that either we've lost or have not yet fully attained. This owl, this is what it looks like to us. This is a very basic way to show it in visible light. You'll see how it's a little bit brighter pink here. This is a black light. This is in the visible light spectrum. And this bright pink area is brighter pink because it is younger feathers. And the owls and other birds can see that spectrum. That spectrum is UVA. So in the UV ultraviolet world, there's 3 bands of light. But there's 2 more we can't see that they see. So we have actually started working with a consultant who is one of the leading professionals on invisible light imaging, who is building these custom camera systems that for really perhaps the first time ever we're looking at invisible light and seeing what animals might see. And so working with the Santa Barbara Museum, we went through countless species to see how are they seeing each other. What does that look like? And so this is the camera system. His name is Dr. Austin Richards. He works with the FBI on forensics, among a lot of other very prominent places. And now we're looking at birds, and we're looking at what is reflecting off of them, what is fluorescing off of them, what is being absorbed by their feathers, and what might they see. And it may lead to a lot of discoveries. In fact, it already is leading to a lot of discoveries about the world of nature that we never would have thought of before. So we started looking at other species, flying squirrels, platypus, Arctic fox. And a good example is in the UV spectrum in Arctic fox. If you were looking at an aerial view in UV on the tundra, and you have a white fox or a white polar bear on snow, in UV, they'd be completely black because their fur reflects that light. And the snow would absorb it, and so that would stay white. So that's a simple way to think about this concept that we're exploring, but it may have broad implications. One of the first implications are it was earlier developed with this similar sort of idea as bird glass, used in skyscrapers and buildings so that birds don't fly into windows and die. Well, we don't see it, but in the glass, in the invisible light spectrum, is a spider web sort of shape that birds are naturally avoid, and therefore more or less avoid most glass that has bird glass in it, using these proprietary chemicals. So or compounds. So the question is, what other ways of seeing nature could we learn and apply them to coexistence the way we did with bird glass? Is there other ways that we could do that in our oceans? Are there other ways that we can do that in our everyday lives using technology? So my role as a photographer is evolving. This has been an incredible year of evolution. This is what we're calling fish vision. This is how it might be hard to see on the screen, but you can kind of tell. It's very dim. It's hard to tell, but you could see a fish. This is what we see. This is what a fish would see, and we have other examples of it. But essentially, their vision in infrared and near infrared allows them to see through the muck and murk in a pond, for instance, a considerable amount more than we can. In some other tests that we've done, you can actually see all the way through with huge grade of detail and resolution. And so, there's a lot of questions that are unanswered, but it also becomes one of the greatest arguments for conservation because there's so much more about the interconnectedness of all things, this fabric of life and the unseen world and connections through all of it that are revealing themselves. And so it's the journey that I've been on with a lot of things, and we'll see where it all goes. But anyway, we'll take some questions. I know I went a little long this evening. I apologize for that, but did want to get through a bunch of different places and things. So feel free, please follow. I've got Nature in Focus on discovery.com. There's all kinds of behind the scenes episodes of things, of animals, and we'll be doing a book signing afterwards as well for Refuge, America's Wildest Places, which is my new book documenting the National Wildlife Refuge System. We went all over for, it's a culmination of essentially 8 years of my life in a book. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. See, I'm used to Zoom. Thank you for watching. And thank you for being here, even more so.
We'll take a few questions, and then I'll announce a little bit of the after.
Sure.
After lecture
Yeah.
reception.
Yeah, right here.
Have you done very much filming or photography with endangered salmonids?
I don't know what that is actually.
Steelhead,
Oh, steelhead salmon? A little bit, yeah. A little bit, yeah. A very early project was with salmon in Northern California, in the Sacramento River and some of the tributaries, as well as in Kenai and the Kenai River and tributaries. Yeah.
we're doing a lot of work with National Wildlife Refuge System.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name's Val.
Hi, Val.
Hi. I have a question about the vision that you are studying of the animals. Is the factor more to do with the eye, or is it something to do with a lateral line, for example, in fish, that might give them that extra vision?
There's a lot of elements to this. It's exceptionally complex. It's something I'm still wrapping my head around. But there's also a lot that could be happening in the brain too. So the eyes and vision are just one very almost small part of the whole process. How our brain interprets it, and then so on. It goes beyond that. We don't really know. We have a ton more to do and a lot more experiments to really better understand all of it. This camera that we're building is really one of the first times that we'll be able to see everything more or less all at once. And one of the things that was explained to us is that basically there's so many surfaces that have never been viewed even. We don't even know what they're going to look like in this light and how animals and other things may see it. What are the things, I don't know how you see everything. It's such a complicated subject matter because what you may see as blue may look my version of red, and we just don't know. It's a sort of a subjective interpretation, which opens up a whole Pandora's box, really, every time I even slightly start to talk about it. So, yeah, sorry, I don't have an incomplete answer on that one. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I'll come back to you.
How many people do you have in your crew, and do you take a boat to get to one of these remote atolls?
Yeah. So various ways. Boats. Found out one of my team is very seasick. Not the time to find out. I have 11 people on my team or so, but we have a lot of support people that we work with as well. In Alaska, we had 4 people on the film crew, 13 total on the boat, so about 8 people, including the first mate, captain, everybody. And it just varies from trip to trip. But almost always I have about 3 people these days. It just depends on whether the island can truly sustain us safely. And the wildlife too, honestly. It's more usually about the wildlife than us. So yeah, it really runs the range. But I'd say on average about 3 for film crew, and then however many biologists and scientists it takes to run the boat or plane or whatever we're on.
I don't need it. I wanted to ask a little bit about your equipment.
Sure.
Are you using Nikon or Canon or something else? And is that both the camera and your lenses? And are your lenses mostly fixed, or are you using?
I'm using Red digital cinema cameras, 6K and 8K resolution with prime lenses, C compact primes, Zeiss. We range anywhere from 15 millimeter to 135 millimeter on the primes. We use telephoto zooms, anywhere from 80 to 1,000 millimeters, plus teleconverters for extensions. And on still photography, I'm primarily using Canon cameras, DSLR with zoom lenses. Sometimes I throw the Zeiss lenses on just because why not? And GoPros occasionally too, which have become good for getting in small areas. So that's the basic build for most things. Sure. Yeah.
I had a question.
Sure. Shoot.
So I've seen that you've done a lot more filmmaking and movies and things of that sort.
Yeah.
Do you feel the best way to portray your kind of conservation message with your photos is in more of these intimate crowds, or do you think the message gets a little bit further with your like Discovery Channel and other things?
I think it takes all. You know, one of the things I like is being across a lot of different platforms. Discovery is massive. I don't know the exact numbers, but a whole lot of people have watched our stuff. You know, I know on social, you know, 500,000 people will watch something on a day, which is crazy to think about sometimes. But, you know, I think it's different audiences have to be reached in different ways. I think it's really about, it's a great question, and I think it's about multi-platform. I think younger audiences, to get them in a theater environment like this and have them immersed in the world, and you know, the lights go out and they have the experience, they're with their friends. I think that's one very fundamentally important experience. I think to be able to just become aware of something through social media is also very important, and just sort of seeds basic awareness, maybe connects on a little bit of a level, educates a little bit. You know, I was in marketing before I started doing all this, and one of the big things was you have to hear the same message over and over and over again repeatedly before it really even starts to stick. I think that stays the same for conservation and education and so on. But I also think it needs to be entertaining. I think that's the most important aspect of it, is that we can't preach or be condescending. It's got to be fun. You got to get out there. You got to like it. I mean, I love doing this stuff. I mean, that's why I do it. It's why I beat my body up when I go out to these places and do all that. It's just a great time. And you know, if you can convey that in film, I think it's great. But I think all of them are great. One of the things I love about Discovery is that it reaches a different kind of audience than I've ever reached before, and that a lot of other people in my space reach. You know, they're not necessarily conservation minded all the time, or all of those folks that we're able to reach. You know, it's the largest network now in the world. And so to have that kind of opportunity to share places that people have never been at all is great. You know, one of the questions as a follow-up to that too that I often get is, well, you know, are you afraid that people will start to go there? Good luck. I mean, some of these places, I'm like, you're not going. You know, one creepy story though, I'll tell you, a little sidebar story on this. We were all the way out. I mean, we were closer to Russia than Alaska in the islands. And a kayaker went by himself on one of the islands. All by himself, just, we saw him in a red kayak with all his stuff on either end of it. I mean, that's adventure, yeah, I don't know. There was no boat out there, so, yeah, that was pretty wild.
The question's a little bit short so that we can have a chance for a book signing
Sure.
and reception. I just want to.
Any others, a couple more, one more, yeah? We have it back, yeah.
I enjoyed your presentation immensely.
Thank you.
If you could, okay, if you could put it in words, observing the behavior of what you were showing with the different species, how would you put that in words? Because I'm a pediatric nurse and I was thinking about the children. Have they given information back to you about what they've absorbed, what their thoughts are?
I mean, it's like our pets, right? I mean, everybody's like, you're waiting for your pet to talk at any moment in time. It's sort of like that after a while. Yeah, you know, I guess the word I would probably use is affectionate. You know, an emotion. There's an emotional consciousness there. Very oftentimes, you know, I think the Laysan Albatross were pretty profound in that way, because you'd see the way they touch the young and nuzzle them and protect them, and there's also the curiosity to have a bird walk up to me and, you know, pull on my zipper and go like this, and I'm pulling on it back, and I'm like, get out of here, and they come back, and it's like this whole interactive dynamic, and they do that with each other, and but you could tell there's an immense amount of affection. You know, those were, you know, I think it's considered one of the most monogamous, if not the most monogamous species on Earth. They don't move on until their partner is gone. And it's also the oldest documented bird in the world is a Laysan Albatross. She just gave birth again at 70, I believe. And again, it kind of goes with this whole, what do we not know about them? But I would say emotionally conscious in some way, in a way that we don't understand probably.
Well, one of the things when you mentioned about the volcanoes erupting, does that have any effect on them, even though it may be a distance? Do they feel it? Do they?
They do, yeah.
Okay.
So the fur seals have been actually documented leaving the island before any sort of major eruption, and then coming back after. And occasionally the birds do not make it because they're nesting in it, and if it just blows, they go with it. But one of the interesting things about the volcanic aspects is it's destructive, but it also, a lot of the species rely on that destructive nature of the volcanoes. And without those so what happens with the upturned rocks, the birds land on them, and over time, their excrement becomes grass, and it covers the holes that they live in. So they eventually run out of places to live over time. And so they have to have something that resets that essentially blows it back up and creates more rubble for them to go nest in the cracks. So it's that interesting paradigm of destruction in life that exists in the natural world. But thank you for coming tonight. And thank you all for coming tonight, too. Peter will say a few words.
Yeah, say a few words. It'll be quick. I just want to remind everybody that the next speaker in the series, also an author, is Emma Maris, and it's a book called Wild Souls. It actually continues on this theme. It asks the question, what's the relationship between humans and wildlife now in this modern age? And she's a brilliant writer and a really thoughtful person. Thank Marriott Courtyard for supporting us, and I want to emphasize that there's we'll exit out that door there. That's how you get out, or also get out to a reception. There'll be a book signing, and there's drinks there, and have more conversation. And one last thing, scientific thing. 2 weeks ago, there was a paper published about global warming. It's anticipated that within maybe 20 years, there'll be 200 days, ice-free days, because of, and the whole landscape up there is going to change because of how it'll change the shipping lane. So that's going to be kind of a shocking and almost inevitable consequence. So if anybody's interested in that, I can send them the paper. And we have a raffle, a new thing. I've never been able to do a raffle. So this is just somebody who turned in a ticket to get a free book. Let's see. This is it. Cindy Matsuda. Oh, well, you'll get it upstairs, and not upstairs, outside, and a winner. So thank you, Ian, and let's go out and continue the conversation.